Today we're going to take a look at an awesome leveling Necromancer build that comes with really good damage and high crits, one of the best group stun abilities, and plenty enough defenses to keep you alive for way longer. The beauty about this build is that you can always transition from a minion based build to get your sacrifices buff and instead run with your own personal damage, or even pick a hybrid and pretty much get ready for the endgame very easily with it. Also, I've attached a convenient build planner guide down below, so you can just follow the links in the description for a quick explanation. Now, this build makes use of the bone skills for the high damage and access to the vulnerable status effect. I opted for the bone splinters, which has a decent resource regen early on via the enhanced version, plus you can already make it give you an 8% crit chance via the initiate's bone splinters. Your core skill will be the bone spear. This is the bread and butter of this build and basically what makes you deal those really high damage hits. It's an amazing option that pierces through multiple enemies, and once fully upgraded, it causes 3 pieces to reflect back and deal even more damage on the return. Now, super early, we're gonna go with the supernatural bone spear because we don't have other sources to apply the vulnerable status effect, so we're gonna use this instead, but only until we get the splintering offensive legendary aspect around chapter 3 in the dry steppes. So once we get that, which is going to just handle the vulnerability side of things, we're gonna then switch to the paranormal bone spear, which is going to give us higher critical hit and also make it spawn additional projectiles whenever we crit with this ability, which we will all the time, as you will see later down the tree. A good way to play with this, by the way, is to position enemies close to walls so that the spear passes through them, breaks into the walls, and then ensures that all the resulting spears reflect back into the enemy for maximized damage. Our next ability is going to be the corpse explosion. It's not going to be the highest damage, but you can consume corpses, deal AoE damage, plus you can increase the radius on it with the enhanced version. Even more so, if you go with the plagued corpse explosion, it's going to deal more damage against stunned, vulnerable, or slowed enemies, which we will apply all 3 of to all enemies in just a bit. So this is always going to make corpse explosion to benefit from these debuffs. You can also place 1 point into Blood Mist while you're here, since Necros are super slow and don't really have many escape routes. This is going to give you a 3-second invulnerability window that also clears any CC upon you. Even more so, you can cast this while stunned, so it can definitely save your butt. Now, once you're at this stage, this is when you'll want to pick the Hued Flesh and the Grim Harvest passives. The first one gives you a lucky hit chance so that you can now spawn extra corpses on the battlefield whenever you hit enemies, a buff that actually doubles against bosses. And since corpses is exactly what you want as a Necromancer, this is going to let you spam your abilities a lot more often, since now you have a lot of them laying on the ground. Meanwhile, the second gives you back extra essences when consuming corpses. And since you will be spamming abilities that do just that, such as Corpse Explosion and Corpse Tendrils, you already solve a part of your mana problem. Now, this brings us to the Corpse Tendril, and possibly the best CC in Diablo 4, since you can make it stun, slow, and even make enemies vulnerable all at the same time. That's why you'll want to go with the Plagued Corpse Tendrils upgrade to do just that. With this, you can now use corpses on the ground to pull multiple enemies in, entire groups basically, completely stun them for a couple of seconds, and as they stay there stunned and debuffed, you're completely free to unleash your most devastating attacks and pull off a few extra explosions. This synergizes very well with the Corpse Explosion Plague passive, so now it benefits from these debuffs that you apply on enemies, so that Corpse Explosion deals a lot more damage. But the CC in and of itself is amazing regardless, because it just saves you not getting hit by all of these enemies at the same time. Now, we're not done here yet. Also, go ahead and grab these 3 passives right here called Serration, Compound Fracture, and Evulsion. All of these 3 combined will provide those massive crit chance buffs that you see on the bone abilities. And this is essentially the reason why you're seeing Bone Spear constantly pulling off high damage numbers, even despite not going with a completely optimized build in this case, just fresh out of leveling, but it's doing really good damage. Now, this is also going to make it skyrocket against groups of enemies, but if you position yourself properly, like I said in the beginning, it also works really well against boss enemies. Now from this point on, at around level 25 to 30, you can now choose one of the following two routes with your build. One, either sacrifice all your minions, including the golem, and focus on maximizing the buffs that the sacrifices give, or if you're like me, pick a more hybrid method and go with sacrificing only the skeletal minions, but keeping the golem as your personal tank. For me, I found the second one to just work better because I needed some extra defenses, and I also wanted a way to still distract enemies while I was free to unleash my attacks. So the golem is the perfect choice for that. So for this, I picked the skirmishers, I sacrificed them and went with a 5% extra crit chance on top. Then I picked the cold mages, sacrificed these as well, and then grabbed the 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Both of these buffs are actually amazing, but we're going to further buff them with the Memento Mori passive a bit later down the tree, which is going to buff these buffs by another 60% on top. And finally, I also picked the Blood Golem, but did not sacrifice it, as instead I went with its first upgrade to absorb 15% of the damage that is done to me. In case it's being done, the Golem is already great at just tanking everything. And by the way, I fully recommend going with the Golem Mastery in this case for the extra Golem HP, since without it I found it to be rather squishy. At around this point, which should be way past level 30, I went ahead and dropped the Blood Mist. I did not need the defenses from it, since the Golem was more than enough, and instead invested those points and a few more into the Bone Storm, one of the ultimate abilities right here. Bone Storm is actually an amazing ability to have because it just gives you everything. It gives you really good AoE damage, both for you but also for the Golem, so you don't have to stick close to the target if you don't want to, though I still recommend doing it. Plus, upgraded version reduces incoming damage, and if you go with the final upgrade, it can even buff your critical chance while the Bone Storm is still running. So all in all, this is something that you can use in burn phases against bosses, or even against very large groups of elites or just normal enemies. It's a matter of choice. You can go ahead and pretty much melt everything. Just keep in mind that the cooldown on it is pretty long, so it's not like you're going to spam it constantly. Finally, we also have the aspect, and I would say that there are only 3 that are an absolute must, though unfortunately they all drop around chapter 3. So this includes the splintering aspect from the Ghoul Run slums right here in the dry steppes. This now makes it so that your bone spears that hit beyond the first enemy now applies a vulnerable debuff, plus the shards on the return now deal a massive bonus damage to all enemies that are vulnerable in this way. In my case, you see me using it on a two-handed weapon, but during the leveling it's better to place it on the amulet instead. You're still getting the bonus damage increase from it, but yeah, don't put it on weapons because you're gonna replace them way too often. I also really enjoyed how strong the aspect of Grasping Veins makes the synergy between the tendrils and some of my other abilities. You find this of course in the Corrupted Grotto right here in the Khagistan region. But this makes you gain a 10% increased critical chance for 6 seconds when you use the Corpse Tendril, and you also gain a 30% bonus critical strike damage to enemies that are damaged by the tendrils. So this just makes you deal so much damage as the enemies are all stunned and vulnerable and just let there at your mercy. So now everything just ties in together very well for some really high damage. Finally, also Aspect of the Torment is another great option for our mana problems. So this one makes critical strikes with the bone skills to buff essence regeneration. This build is actually quite resource intensive. There's even upgrades in there that can further increase the damage, but at the cost of further increasing the essence consumption. So you're going to want as many of these as you can. For everything else, pick either offenses, defenses, or anything else depending on your setup and your current state. So you can just go with whatever you want to fully maximize your build as you get more cool upgrades in the leveling stages. This is pretty much it. Let me know down below how many of you are using Necromancers and which build you went with. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and until the next video.